The metal handcuffs felt cold against her wrists as Lieutenant Riley Chen sat perfectly straight in the wooden chair. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform looked crisp despite everything that had happened. But something was missing. The patches on her shoulders were gone. The ribbons on her chest had been removed. Even her name tag was nowhere to be seen. The courtroom was packed with people she didn't recognize. Reporters scribbled notes in the back rows, while cameras flashed every few seconds. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her, wondering how someone like her ended up here. Riley had seen courtrooms on TV shows, but this felt different. The air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed louder than it should be. "Thayas, defendant stands accused of murder," announced the prosecutor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke like he was reading from a textbook. On March 15th, during a military operation in Eastern Europe, Lieutenant Chen fired her weapon without proper authorization. Her actions resulted in the death of an innocent civilian. Riley kept her face blank, just like she'd been trained to do. But inside, her mind was racing. Innocent civilian? That wasn't what she remembered. The man she'd shot had been pointing a weapon at her teammate. She'd had less than 2 seconds to make a decision. 2 seconds to save a life or watch someone die. The prosecutor continued his opening statement, painting a picture of a soldier who'd gone rogue. He talked about rules and regulations, about the importance of following orders. He made it sound like Riley had just decided to shoot someone for fun. The jury listened carefully, their faces serious and concerned. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, walking closer to them, "we train our soldiers to be disciplined. We teach them when to shoot and when not to shoot. But sometimes even the best training fails. Sometimes a soldier makes a choice that goes against everything we stand for." Riley's lawyer, a young captain named Thompson, looked nervous. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled through his papers. He'd only been assigned to her case 3 weeks ago, and it showed. Every time he spoke to her, he seemed uncertain, like he wasn't sure what questions to ask or how to defend her. The prosecution called their first witness, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez. Riley recognized him immediately. They'd served together for 2 years, gone through some of the toughest training the Navy had to offer. He'd been there that night in Eastern Europe. He'd seen what really happened, but as Mike walked to the witness stand, he wouldn't look at her. His eyes stayed focused on the floor, then on the prosecutor, then on the jury. Anywhere but at Riley. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the prosecutor began, "you were part of Lieutenant Chen's team during the operation in question. Can you tell us what you witnessed?" Mike cleared his throat. "We were conducting a hostage rescue mission. Our orders were clear. Get in, secure the hostages, get out. Minimal force unless absolutely necessary." "And did Lieutenant Chen follow those orders?" Mike hesitated for just a moment. Riley saw it, even if nobody else did. "No, sir. She took a shot when there was no clear threat. The target wasn't armed, and he wasn't threatening anyone at that moment." Riley felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Mike was lying. She knew he was lying because he'd been standing right next to her when it happened. He'd seen the weapon in the man's hand. He'd heard the shouting in a foreign language. He'd watched as the man raised his gun toward their teammate. But here he was, under oath, telling a completely different story. The prosecutor smiled slightly. "So, in your professional opinion, was Lieutenant Chen's action justified?" "No, sir. It was not." Riley's mind drifted back to that night 3 months ago. They'd been inserted into a small city just after midnight. The mission was supposed to be routine, rescue 3 American contractors who'd been kidnapped by a local gang. Intelligence reports said the building was lightly defended, maybe 4 or 5 guards at most. But intelligence reports were often wrong. She remembered the weight of her rifle as they approached the building, the way her night vision goggles made everything look green and grainy, the sound of her own breathing inside her helmet. She'd done missions like this dozens of times before. It should have been simple. The courtroom brought her back to reality. Another witness was being called, Corporal Amy Washington, one of the newer members of their team. Amy had only been with them for 6 months, but she was good. Quick learner, steady under pressure. "Corporal Washington," the prosecutor said, "you've heard Sergeant Rodriguez's testimony. Do you agree with his account of events?" Amy nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, sir." "Lieutenant Chen fired without authorization. The target posed no immediate threat to our team." Riley watched Amy's face carefully. There was something wrong here. Amy's left eye was twitching slightly, a nervous habit Riley had noticed during training exercises. Amy only did that when she was stressed or lying about something, but why? Would her own team lie about what happened? These were people she'd trusted with her life, people she'd pulled out of dangerous situations, people she'd trained and fought alongside for years. The prosecution continued calling witnesses throughout the morning. Each one told the same story, that Riley had acted recklessly, that she'd violated the rules of engagement, that an innocent person had died because of her actions. During the lunch break, Riley sat alone in a small room with her lawyer. The handcuffs had been removed temporarily, and she rubbed her wrists where the metal had left red marks. "This isn't looking good," Captain Thompson said, stating the obvious. "Your own team is testifying against you. The evidence seems pretty clear." "They're lying," Riley said quietly. "I don't know why, but they're all lying." Thompson looked uncomfortable. "Look, Lieutenant, I know this is hard to hear, but maybe you should consider a plea deal. The prosecution might be willing to reduce the charges if you show remorse and cooperate." Riley stared at him for a long moment. "I won't admit to something I didn't do." That man was armed. He was about to shoot Corporal Washington. I saved her life. But your team says otherwise. Why would they lie? That was the question that had been eating at Riley for weeks. Why would Mike lie? Why would Amy? Why would any of them throw her under the bus like this? She'd always been tough on her team, pushed them to be better, but she'd never been unfair. She'd always had their backs. The afternoon session began with more testimony from her team members. Each story was consistent, almost too consistent. They all described the same scene, Riley firing at an unarmed civilian who posed no threat. They all used similar language, similar phrases. It was like they'd rehearsed it. Riley's father sat in the gallery behind her, his military posture unmistakable even in civilian clothes. Colonel David Chen had served 3 tours in Vietnam and another 2 in Iraq. He'd taught Riley everything about honor and duty and serving your country. Now he watched his daughter being painted as a criminal, and she could only imagine what he was thinking. The media had been brutal. The headlines called her everything from rogue soldier to the killer SEAL. Television news shows debated whether women should be allowed in combat roles at all. Talk radio hosts used her case to make political points about military discipline and accountability. None of them knew what really happened that night. None of them had been there. As the day ended and Riley was led back to her cell, she caught a glimpse of someone in the hallway. A tall woman in a Navy uniform with more ribbons than Riley had ever seen on one person. The woman's hair was silver gray and her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She watched as Riley passed by, her expression unreadable. Riley didn't recognize her, but something about the woman seemed important, significant, like she was someone who could change things if she wanted to. But right now, Riley was alone. Her team had abandoned her, her lawyer seemed defeated before the trial had even really begun, and the evidence against her was mounting. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more lies, and more damage to her reputation and her life. She'd spent 8 years serving her country, earning respect through blood and sweat and determination. She'd been one of the few women to make it through SEAL training, one of the best marksmen in the Navy. She'd saved lives and completed missions that others couldn't handle. Now she sat in a military prison cell, accused of the very thing she'd spent her career trying to prevent, the senseless death of an innocent person. But Riley knew the truth, and somehow she had to find a way to prove it. The second day of the trial began with a storm outside. Rain hammered against the courtroom windows as people filed in, shaking water from their umbrellas and coats. Riley watched the drops race down the glass, wishing she could be anywhere else. In the world. Her handcuffs clicked as she shifted in her chair. The sound had become familiar over the past few weeks, but she still wasn't used to it. Every movement reminded her of how far she'd fallen from the woman who used to lead missions in hostile territory. "The prosecution calls Staff Sergeant Kevin Park to the stand," announced the prosecutor. Riley's heart sank. Kevin was her former squad leader, someone she'd looked up to for years. If anyone would tell the truth, it should be him. But as Kevin walked to the witness stand, Riley noticed something different about him. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing toward the back of the courtroom where several high-ranking officers sat. His usual confident stride seemed forced, like he was walking through mud. "Staff Sergeant Park," the prosecutor began, "you supervised Lieutenant Chen for 18 months. Would you describe her as someone who followed orders?" Kevin hesitated for just a moment. "Riley, Lieutenant Chen was always thorough in her work, but she could be impulsive sometimes." Riley felt a chill run down her spine. Impulsive? Kevin had always praised her quick thinking in dangerous situations. He'd written glowing performance reviews, recommending her for advanced training and leadership positions. "Can you tell us about the night in question?" "We were conducting a hostage rescue. Our briefing was clear, minimal casualties, precise, extraction. But when we got inside the building, Lieutenant Chen seemed different, more aggressive than usual." The prosecutor nodded. "Different how?" "She kept saying something wasn't right, that the intelligence was wrong. But our orders were specific, and we'd trained for weeks based on that intelligence." Riley remembered that conversation. She'd noticed inconsistencies in their briefing materials, floor plans that didn't match the building's actual layout, guard positions that seemed off. But Kevin was making it sound like she'd been paranoid or unstable. "And what happened when you encountered the deceased?" Kevin looked down at his hands. "We found him in a side room. He appeared to be unarmed, just standing there." "Lieutenant," Chen raised her rifle immediately. "Did you give her permission to fire?" "No, sir. I told her to hold her position, but she fired anyway." Riley wanted to scream. That wasn't what happened at all. The man had been reaching for something behind a desk. She'd seen the metal glint in the dim light. Kevin had been looking the other way when it happened, dealing with one of the hostages. But here he was, under oath, describing a completely different scene. The prosecution's next piece of evidence was a video recording from one of the team's helmet cameras. Riley's stomach dropped as the large monitor in the courtroom flickered to life. The grainy, green-tinted footage showed their team moving through the building. "This footage was recovered from Corporal Jackson's helmet camera," the prosecutor explained. "Please watch carefully." The video showed the team entering the room where the shooting occurred. Riley could see herself in the corner of the frame, rifle ready. The man they'd shot was partially visible, though the angle wasn't perfect. "As you can see," the prosecutor continued, "the deceased appears to have his hands visible. There's no weapon in sight, but Riley knew the camera angle was misleading. From where Corporal Jackson had been standing, you couldn't see the desk where the weapon was hidden. The footage made it look like she'd shot an unarmed, harmless person." "During the break," Captain Thompson tried to reassure her, "we'll have our chance to present your side. Don't worry." But Riley was worried. Every piece of evidence seemed to support the prosecution's version of events. Her own teammates were painting her as a reckless soldier who'd snapped under pressure. The video footage, while incomplete, didn't help her case. "Why are they doing this?" she asked her lawyer. "These people know me. They know I'm not a killer." Thompson shuffled through his papers nervously. "Military politics can be complicated. Sometimes people say what they think their superiors want to hear." The afternoon session brought more devastating testimony. Peishu, prosecution called Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensics expert who'd examined the scene. Her analysis of bullet trajectories and blood splatter patterns seemed to support the prosecution's timeline of events. Based on my examination, Dr. Vasquez testified, the deceased was shot from approximately 15 feet away. The angle suggests he was not in an aggressive posture when the fatal shot was fired. Riley closed her eyes, remembering the split second when she'd pulled the trigger. The man had been reaching for something. She'd seen his arm move, seen his body language change from passive to threatening, but forensic evidence didn't capture intent or body language. The most painful testimony came from the victim's family. Through a translator, his wife described him as a simple shopkeeper who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. His teenage daughter held up a photo of him smiling at a family gathering. Riley felt genuine sadness for their loss. She understood their pain and anger. But she also knew that the man they were describing wasn't the same person she'd encountered that night. Intelligence reports had identified him as connected to the kidnapping operation, though those reports were classified and couldn't be presented in court. As the family left the witness stand, Riley caught sight of the mysterious woman from the previous day. She was sitting further back now, partially hidden behind a pillar. The woman's eyes were fixed on Riley with an intensity that was both unsettling and somehow reassuring. The prosecution's final witness of the day was Commander Patricia Wells, Riley's former commanding officer. Riley had always respected Commander Wells, who'd fought hard to open more opportunities for women in special operations. But as she took the witness stand, her expression was cold and professional. Commander Wells, the prosecutor began, in your opinion, was Lieutenant Chen properly trained for the mission in question? All of my personnel receive extensive training in rules of engagement. Lieutenant Chen had completed the required courses and passed all assessments. So she knew the rules? Yes, she did. Then how do you explain her actions that night? Commander Wells paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Combat situations are inherently stressful. Even well-trained soldiers can make poor decisions. Under pressure, it appears that's what happened here. Riley felt like she'd been stabbed in the back. Commander Wells had always supported her, had even recommended her for the advanced sniper training that made her one of the Navy's most accurate marksmen. Now she was suggesting that Riley had cracked under pressure like some rookie recruit. During cross-examination, Captain Thompson tried to establish Riley's exemplary service record, but Commander Wells's responses were carefully neutral. She acknowledged Riley's past achievements, but emphasized that previous performance didn't. Excuse current failures. Everyone has a breaking point, Commander Wells said. Perhaps Lieutenant Chen reached hers. As the day ended, Riley was escorted back to her holding cell. The storm outside had gotten worse, with thunder now accompanying the rain. The weather seemed to match her mood perfectly. She sat on the narrow bunk and thought about her career. 8 years of service, dozens of successful missions, countless hours of training. She'd been shot at, blown up, and nearly drowned on various operations. She'd saved hostages, gathered intelligence, and eliminated genuine threats to American security. None of that seemed to matter now. Her father visited that evening, his face grim behind the reinforced glass of the visiting room. They spoke through phones, the conversation monitored and recorded. I don't understand what's happening, he said quietly. The daughter I raised wouldn't have done what they're saying. I didn't do it, Dad. Not the way they're describing it. Colonel. Chen studied her face carefully. I believe you, but the evidence is incomplete. They're not telling the whole story. Then what is the whole story? Riley looked around the visiting room, knowing that everything they said was being listened to. I can't tell you everything. Some of it's still classified, but I need you to trust me. Her father nodded slowly. I do trust you, but the court might not. Your own people are testifying against you. That was the part that hurt most. Not the media coverage or the public scrutiny, but the betrayal by people she'd trusted with her life. people who knew her character and her dedication to serving others. As she was led back to her cell that night, Riley noticed increased security in the hallways. More guards, more cameras, more restrictions. It was like they expected her to try, to escape, though she had nowhere to run and wouldn't abandon her fight for the truth. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm outside. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, and probably more lies. But something told her that the woman in the courtroom, the one with the silver hair and intense eyes, might be important. Riley didn't know who she was or why she kept showing up. But there was something about her presence that suggested this case was more complicated than anyone was admitting. Something that went beyond a simple case of a soldier making a bad decision. The truth was out there somewhere, buried, under layers of classified information and political maneuvering. Riley just had to figure out how to find it before it was too late. The third day of the trial started differently. Captain Thompson looked more confident as he walked into the courtroom, carrying a thick folder that hadn't been there before. Riley noticed the change immediately. Her young lawyer's hands weren't shaking, and he actually made eye contact with her when he sat down. "What's going on?" Riley whispered as the bailiff called the court to order. "I spent all night going through the evidence again," Thompson replied quietly. "Something's not right with their story. The prosecution called their first witness, Lieutenant Alex Morrison, the team's communications specialist." Riley remembered Alex as quiet but reliable, someone who always followed protocol to the letter. But as Alex approached the witness stand, Riley noticed something odd. The young officer kept touching his left ear, a nervous habit Riley had seen during their first few missions together. "Lieutenant Morrison," the prosecutor began, "you were responsible for radio communications during the operation. Can you confirm the timeline of events?" Alex cleared his throat twice before answering. "Yes, sir. We entered the building at 0247 hours. First contact with hostiles was at 0251. The incident occurred at approximately 0256 hours. And during this time, did you hear Lieutenant Chen receive any authorization to fire?" "No, sir. Radio chatter was minimal to maintain operational security." Captain Thompson stood up for cross-examination, and Riley could see a new determination in his eyes. "Lieutenant Morrison, you said radio chatter was minimal. But according to your own communication logs, there were actually 17 separate radio transmissions during the 5-minute window in question. Would you call 17 transmissions minimal?" Alex's face went pale. Well, some of those were automatic position updates from our GPS systems." "How many were automatic, and how many were voice communications?" "I don't remember exactly." Thompson pulled out a document from his folder. "According to the technical analysis of your radio equipment, only 4 transmissions were automatic GPS updates. The other 13 were voice communications. That's nearly 3 transmissions per minute. Would you still call that minimal?" Riley watched Alex squirm in his seat. The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed the questioning to continue. "Lieutenant Morrison, in your previous statement to investigators, you said Lieutenant Chen seemed unusually quiet during the mission. But if there were 13 voice communications in 5 minutes, how could she have been unusually quiet?" "I meant she wasn't talking as much as usual." "As much as usual for what? You've only been on 3 missions with Lieutenant Chen. In those previous missions, how many voice communications did she typically make in a 5-minute combat situation?" Alex looked trapped. "I don't have exact numbers," Thompson pressed on. "Isn't it true, Lieutenant, that you received a promotion and transferred to the Pentagon just 2 weeks after this incident?" The prosecutor jumped up. "Objection! Relevance goes to potential bias, Your Honor." "I'll allow it." Thompson repeated his question. Alex shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Yes, I received a promotion." "A promotion that jumped you over 3 other lieutenants with more seniority and better performance reviews?" "I don't know about their performance reviews." "But you do know about the promotion, don't you?" A promotion that came with a significant pay increase and a prestigious assignment in Washington, D.C.? Alex's voice was barely audible. Yes. Riley felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Thompson was exposing something that nobody had noticed before: the suspicious timing of Alex's career advancement. The next witness was Dr. James Chen, the medical examiner who'd performed the autopsy on the victim. Riley noticed he shared the same last name as her father, though they weren't related. Dr. Chen appeared nervous as he took the stand, constantly adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. "Dr. Chen," the prosecutor began, "your autopsy report concluded that the victim died from a single gunshot wound. Can you describe your findings?" The victim sustained a fatal wound to the chest. The bullet entered at a downward angle, consistent with being shot by someone in an elevated position. Was there anything unusual about the wound pattern? Dr. Chen hesitated. No, nothing unusual. But Riley caught something in his voice, a slight tremor that suggested he wasn't telling the complete truth. When Thompson began his cross-examination, he seemed to have caught it too. "Dr. Chen, you've been a medical examiner for how long?" 15 years. "And in those 15 years, approximately how many gunshot victims have you examined?" "Hundreds." "So, you would consider yourself experienced in identifying different types of gunshot wounds?" "Yes." Thompson pulled out a photograph from his folder. "This is a photo of the victim's chest wound, taken during your examination. Do you notice anything unusual about the powder burns around the entry point?" Dr. Chen studied the photo for a long moment. "The burns are less extensive than I would expect for a shot fired from 15 feet. "Less extensive, meaning the shot was fired from a greater distance?" "Possibly. How much greater? 20 feet? 30 feet? Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable. "Based on the powder burn pattern, I would estimate the shot was fired from at least 25 to 30 feet away." Riley felt her heart racing. The prosecution had claimed she was only 15 feet from the victim when she fired. But if Dr. Chen was right, she'd been much farther away. That would support her version of events, that she'd taken a long-range shot to protect her teammate, not executed someone at close range. "Dr. Chen, why wasn't this discrepancy noted in your original report?" I was told the distance had been confirmed by other evidence." "Told by whom?" The prosecutor objected, but the damage was done. It was becoming clear that Dr. Chen had been pressured to alter his findings to match the prosecution's narrative. During the lunch break, Riley noticed increased activity around the courthouse. More security guards, more official-looking cars in the parking lot. Something was happening, though she couldn't tell what. "They're scared," Thompson said as they ate their sandwiches in the small conference room. "Someone's getting nervous about these inconsistencies." "What do you think is really going on?" "I think your mission that night was more complicated than anyone's admitting. And I think some very powerful people want to keep it that way." The afternoon session brought the most shocking development yet. The prosecution called Agent Lisa Park from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Riley had never heard of her, but Agent Park claimed to have analyzed all the intelligence reports related to their mission. "Agent Park," the prosecutor began, "based on your analysis, was the deceased known to intelligence services?" "No, sir. Our records show no previous intelligence on the victim. He appears to have been an ordinary civilian with no connections to hostile activities." But as Agent Park testified, Riley noticed something strange. The woman kept glancing at a man in the gallery who was taking detailed notes. Every time she made a claim about the victim's background, she would look at this man as if seeking approval. When Thompson cross-examined Agent Park, he asked to see the original intelligence files. "I'm sorry," Agent Park replied, "but those files are classified at a level above this court's clearance. So we're supposed to take your word about what's in files that nobody else can see." "That's how classified intelligence works, counselor." Thompson pulled out another document. Agent Park, this is a FOIA request filed by a journalist 3 days ago. It specifically asks for any intelligence reports related to the deceased. The agency's response was that no such reports exist. If no reports exist, what exactly did you analyze? Agent Park's face flushed red. The reports I analyzed may not be subject to FOIA requests due to their sensitive nature. So these mystery reports exist, but they're too secret for court review and too secret for public disclosure. How convenient. The judge intervened. Counselor, please stick to questions. But Thompson had made his point. Agent Park's testimony was based on evidence that nobody else could examine or verify. As the day wound down, Riley noticed the mysterious woman with silver hair was back in the gallery. But this time, she wasn't alone. A younger man in a Navy uniform sat beside her, and they were having what appeared to be an intense conversation. Captain Thompson gathered his papers with obvious satisfaction. "We're making progress," he told Riley. "Their story is starting to fall apart. But will it be enough? I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think this case is about more than just what happened in that room." That evening, Riley received an unexpected visitor. Instead of her father, a woman she didn't recognize sat behind the glass in the visiting room. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and graying brown hair. "I'm Janet Rodriguez," the woman said through the phone. "Mike's mother." Riley's stomach dropped. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was one of the teammates who testified against her. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't think you should be here." "Yes, I should. My son came home after that mission different. He won't talk about what really happened, but he's been having nightmares, drinking more than he should. Something's eating at him. I can't discuss the case." "You don't have to. I just want you to know that the Mike who testified yesterday isn't the same Mike who used to talk about you with respect and admiration. Someone got to him. Someone scared him into saying things he doesn't believe." Mrs. Rodriguez leaned closer, to the glass. "I've known my son for 28 years. I know when he's lying. And he was lying on that witness stand." Riley felt tears building in her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I raised him better than that. And because I think you deserve to know that at least one person believes you." As Mrs. Rodriguez left, Riley sat alone in the visiting room for several more minutes. For the first time since the trial began, she didn't feel completely abandoned. Someone out there knew the truth wasn't being told. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full picture was still unclear. Thompson had exposed inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, but they still didn't know why Riley's own teammates were lying or who was orchestrating the cover-up. Riley returned to her cell that night with mixed emotions. Hope was beginning to replace despair, but she knew they still had a long way to go. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses and more opportunities to expose the truth. As she lay on her narrow bunk, Riley thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's words. If Mike was being pressured to lie, then probably the others were too. But pressured by whom and why? The answer to those questions might determine whether she spent the rest of her life in prison or walked free to continue serving her country. The fourth day began with an energy that Riley hadn't felt since the trial started. Captain Thompson arrived early, carrying not just his usual folder but also a laptop and what appeared to be encrypted communications equipment. Riley watched, him set up at the defense table with movements that seemed almost excited. "What's happening?" she asked, as the handcuffs were removed for the day's proceedings. "I got a message last night," Thompson whispered. "Someone wants to help us. Someone, with access to information we haven't seen before." The courtroom filled with the usual crowd, but Riley noticed several new faces in the gallery, men and women in expensive suits who looked like they belonged in Washington, D.C. boardrooms rather than military courtrooms. The mysterious woman with silver hair was there too, but today she sat in the front row where everyone could see her. The prosecution called their first witness, Commander Robert Hayes, the officer who had planned the original mission. Riley knew Commander Hayes by reputation only. He was known for running operations that always went exactly according to plan, never deviating from the briefing materials. "Commander Hayes," the prosecutor began, "can you describe the mission parameters for the hostage rescue operation?" "Certainly. We received intelligence that 3 American contractors had been kidnapped by a local criminal organization. The hostages were being held in a residential building in the target city. Our objective was simple: get in, extract the hostages, minimize casualties." "And was Lieutenant Chen briefed on these parameters?" "Yes. All team members received identical briefings. The mission was straightforward." But when Captain Thompson began his cross-examination, Riley could see he had something specific in mind. "Commander Hayes, you say the mission was straightforward. But isn't it unusual for a SEAL team to be deployed for what sounds like a police matter?" "Not at all. American citizens were in danger." "American citizens who worked for which company?" Commander Hayes paused. "That information is classified." "Classified? Why would the employer of kidnapping victims be classified information?" "Some government contractors require operational security even when their employees are in distress." Thompson pulled out a document from his laptop case. "Commander, I have here a State Department cable from 2 days before the mission. It identifies the 3 hostages as employees of Meridian Technical Solutions. Are you familiar with that company?" "I may have heard the name." "Meridian Technical Solutions is a CIA front company, isn't it?" The prosecutor shot up from his chair. "Objection! Relevance?" "Your Honor, if this was actually a CIA operation disguised as a simple hostage rescue, it directly impacts my client's actions and state of mind." The judge thought for a moment. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Counselor," Thompson continued. "Commander Hayes, did you know that Meridian Technical Solutions doesn't actually provide technical solutions? According to corporate filings, they specialize in international consulting and risk assessment, which is standard language for intelligence operations." Commander Hayes was sweating now. "I plan missions based on the intelligence I'm given. I don't investigate the background of every civilian involved. But you would investigate if you suspected the mission briefing was incomplete, wouldn't you?" "Of course." "Then why didn't you question why a simple kidnapping required a 6-week advanced surveillance operation? Why didn't you ask why satellite imagery of the target building was updated hourly instead of daily? Why didn't you wonder why the supposed kidnappers had access to military-grade communications equipment?" Riley watched Commander Hayes struggle to answer. Each question revealed another layer of complexity that hadn't been mentioned in any of the earlier testimony. "I trusted the intelligence I was provided," Hayes finally said. "Intelligence provided by whom?" "That's classified." Thompson smiled slightly. "Let me ask a different question. During the mission planning phase, did anyone suggest that the operation might involve more than just rescuing kidnapped contractors?" "I don't understand the question." "Did anyone mention the possibility that one or more of the hostages might actually be intelligence assets who needed extraction for reasons beyond a simple kidnapping?" The courtroom went completely silent. Riley could feel the tension in the air as everyone waited for Hayes' answer. That's not information I can discuss in this setting." But his hesitation had already provided the answer. Riley's mind raced as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. If the hostages were actually intelligence operatives, then the mission had been much more complex than anyone had admitted. The prosecution's next witness was Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who claimed to have analyzed Riley's mental state during the mission. Riley had never met Dr. Foster and had certainly never undergone any psychological evaluation related to the operation. "Dr. Foster," the prosecutor began, "based on your analysis of Lieutenant Chen's behavior patterns, do you believe she was mentally fit for duty during the mission in question?" "Based on the evidence I've reviewed, Lieutenant Chen showed signs of paranoid thinking and excessive aggression. Her claims that something wasn't right with the intelligence suggest possible dissociation from reality." Riley felt anger building in her chest. This woman had never spoken to her, never examined her, never even been present during the mission. Yet she was making clinical judgments about Riley's mental state. When Thompson cross-examined Dr. Foster, he was clearly prepared. "Dr. Foster, you've never actually met Lieutenant Chen, have you?" "No, but I've reviewed extensive documentation." "What documentation?" "Mission reports, testimony from team members, performance evaluations." "Have you reviewed Lieutenant Chen's complete military medical records?" "I was provided with relevant excerpts." Thompson pulled out another thick file. "These are Lieutenant Chen's complete medical records. They show no history of mental health issues, no signs of paranoia or aggression, and consistently high marks for decision-making under pressure. In fact, her psychological evaluations consistently praise her ability to adapt to changing situations. How do you reconcile your analysis with 15 years of documented mental stability?" Dr. Foster looked uncomfortable. "People can change under extreme stress." "Can they? Or is it possible that someone experiencing extreme stress might actually see things more clearly than people who aren't directly involved in the situation?" "I don't understand the question." "Dr. Foster, if Lieutenant Chen was correct that something was wrong with the intelligence, if the mission was actually more complicated than the briefing suggested, would her concerns represent paranoid thinking or appropriate situational awareness?" "Well, if the concerns were justified—" "Thank you, Dr. Foster, that's all." During the afternoon break, Riley noticed unusual activity in the courthouse hallways. Men in dark suits were having hushed conversations, and several court officials seemed nervous and distracted. "Something big is happening," Thompson told her quietly. "I think our questions are making some very important people uncomfortable." The day's final witness was the person Riley had been dreading most, Captain David Reynolds, her former commanding officer and mentor. Reynolds had recruited her for special operations, had personally overseen her advanced training, and had been like a father figure to her for years. But as Captain Reynolds took the witness stand, he looked older than Riley remembered. His shoulders sagged slightly, and there were deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Captain Reynolds," the prosecutor began, "you commanded Lieutenant Chen for 3 years. In your professional opinion, did she have the judgment necessary for complex military operations?" Reynolds looked directly at Riley for the first time since entering the courtroom. Something passed between them. Not words, but understanding. "Lieutenant Chen was one of the finest officers I ever commanded," he said quietly. "Her judgment was impeccable, and her dedication to her teammates was absolute." The prosecutor looked surprised. This wasn't the testimony he'd expected. "Captain, given your high opinion of Lieutenant Chen, how do you explain her actions during the mission in question?" Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "I can't explain them based on the information that's been presented in this courtroom." "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Lieutenant Chen I know would never have fired without justification. If she took that shot, she had a reason, a good reason." The prosecutor scrambled to recover. "But Captain, the evidence clearly shows—" "The evidence shows part of the story," Reynolds interrupted, "but not all of it. Are you suggesting that Lieutenant Chen was justified in killing an unarmed civilian?" Reynolds met the prosecutor's eyes steadily. "I'm suggesting that if Lieutenant Chen fired her weapon, then whoever she shot wasn't as innocent as we've been led to believe." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Riley felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that at least one person who knew her well was willing to stand up for her. When Thompson cross-examined Captain Reynolds, he asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Captain Reynolds, based on your knowledge of Lieutenant Chen and your experience with classified operations, is it possible that this mission involved elements that haven't been disclosed in this courtroom?" Reynolds looked around the courtroom, his gaze stopping on the woman with silver hair in the front row. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," he said firmly. I believe there were significant elements of this operation that remain classified, and I believe those elements would completely change how we understand Lieutenant Chen's actions. Can you elaborate? Not without proper authorization, but I can say this. Lieutenant Chen served her country faithfully and honorably. Whatever happened that night, she was doing her job as she understood it needed to be done. As the day ended, Riley felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Captain Reynolds had publicly defended her, Commander Hayes had revealed. Inconsistencies in the mission briefing, and Dr. Foster's analysis had been thoroughly discredited. But more importantly, it was becoming clear that the mission had been far more complex than anyone had admitted. The mention of CIA front companies, intelligence assets, and classified elements painted a picture of an operation that went far, beyond a simple hostage rescue. Riley was beginning to understand that she hadn't just been caught in a case of military justice gone wrong. She'd been caught in something much bigger, a web of intelligence operations and classified missions that powerful people wanted to keep secret. As she was led back to her cell that night, Riley noticed that the woman with silver hair was still in the courthouse, now surrounded by several high-ranking military officers in heated conversation. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new questions, and hopefully new answers. But tonight, for the first time in months, Riley fell asleep believing that the truth might finally be coming to light. The fifth day of the trial began with an atmosphere Riley had never experienced before. The courthouse was surrounded by military vehicles, and men in dark suits seemed to be everywhere. As she was escorted into the building, she noticed that many of the regular reporters and spectators had been replaced by official-looking people she didn't recognize. Captain Thompson was already at the defense table when Riley arrived, but he looked different. Gone was the nervous young lawyer who had struggled through the first few days. In his place sat a man who looked confident, almost excited about what was coming. "What's going on?" Riley whispered as her handcuffs were removed. "Today, everything changes," Thompson replied quietly. "I can't tell you more right now, but trust me." The judge entered the courtroom, but before he could call the session to order, the prosecutor stood up with an unusual request. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to present our closing arguments today. We believe we've proven our case beyond reasonable doubt." Riley's heart sank. She had been hoping for more time, more opportunities to expose the truth about her mission, but the judge nodded his agreement. "Very well. The prosecution may proceed with closing arguments." The prosecutor walked confidently to the jury box, his voice strong and certain. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple. Lieutenant Riley Chen violated her oath as a soldier. She ignored her training, disregarded her orders, and killed an innocent person. The evidence is overwhelming." He pointed dramatically at Riley. "Her own teammates have testified that she acted without authorization. Video footage shows the victim was unarmed. Forensic evidence confirms he posed no threat. This is not a complex case of military strategy or classified operations. This is about a soldier who made a terrible choice and must face the consequences." Riley watched the jury as the prosecutor spoke. Some of them nodded along with his words. Others looked uncertain, possibly influenced by the inconsistencies that Thompson had exposed over the past few days. "The defense wants you to believe in conspiracy theories and hidden agendas," the prosecutor continued. "But sometimes the simple explanation is the correct one. Lieutenant Chen killed an unarmed civilian, and she must be held accountable." As the prosecutor finished his closing argument, Riley felt the weight of the moment. If the jury believed his version of events, she would spend the rest of her life in prison for a crime she knew she hadn't committed. Thompson stood up to present the defense's closing argument, but before he could speak, something extraordinary happened. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a force that made everyone turn around. Through those doors walked a woman who commanded instant attention from every person in the room. She was tall and dignified, with silver gray hair pulled back in a perfect military style. Her navy uniform was covered with ribbons and decorations that told the story of a lifetime of distinguished service. but it was her presence that filled the room, an aura of authority and respect that made even the judge sit up straighter. Behind her walked two younger officers, also in dress uniforms, carrying leather portfolios and maintaining the precise bearing of military escorts. Riley recognized the woman immediately, even though she had only seen her from a distance before. This was Admiral Catherine Blackwood, one of the most respected officers in the entire Navy. Riley had read about her legendary career, combat service in 3 different conflicts, pioneering work in special operations, and a reputation for absolute integrity that was known throughout the military. The entire courtroom fell silent as Admiral Blackwood walked down the center aisle. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet, and Riley could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Admiral Blackwood approached the judge's bench, her bearing straight and professional. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I have information critical to this case that cannot wait." The judge looked stunned. "Admiral Blackwood, this is highly unusual." "Yes, Your Honor, it is, but this case involves matters of national security that require immediate attention." Riley watched in amazement as Admiral Blackwood reached into her jacket and pulled out a folder with red classification markings across the cover. The folder was thick, and it looked like it contained documents that could change everything. "Your Honor," Admiral Blackwood continued, "I request an immediate closed session with you and both counsels. The information I have cannot be disclosed in open court, but it directly relates to Lieutenant Chen's actions and the circumstances of this case." The prosecutor jumped up from his table. "Your Honor, this is an obvious attempt to disrupt our proceedings. The prosecution objects to any delay." But Admiral Blackwood turned to face the prosecutor with a look that could have frozen water. "Counselor, I have served this country for 32 years. I have held some of the highest security clearances in the military. When I tell you that I have information critical to a case involving one of my officers, you would be wise to listen." The judge banged his gavel. "Court will recess for 1 hour. Admiral Blackwood, counsels, please join me in my chambers immediately." As the courtroom emptied, Riley was left alone with her thoughts and a guard. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Admiral Blackwood, the Admiral Blackwood, had just walked into her trial carrying classified information that might save her life. An hour later, when everyone returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had completely changed. The prosecutor looked pale and shaken. The judge appeared troubled, constantly adjusting his glasses and shuffling papers. Captain Thompson, meanwhile, looked like he had just received the best news of his life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the judge announced, "due to new information that has come to light, this court must declare a recess while certain matters are reviewed. The jury is dismissed for the remainder of the day." As the confused jury filed out, Admiral Blackwood approached Riley's table. Riley started to stand, but the Admiral placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Stay seated, Lieutenant," Admiral Blackwood said quietly. "We have much to discuss." Riley looked up into the Admiral's eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: warmth and understanding, mixed with what looked like anger at the situation Riley had been put through. "Admiral, I don't understand what's happening." "I know you don't, and that's partly my fault. There are aspects of your mission that were kept from you for your own protection. But that protection became a prison when you were accused of crimes you didn't commit." Admiral Blackwood sat down across from Riley, her manner becoming less formal and more personal. "Lieutenant, I've read every report about your service. I know about your training scores, your mission record, your character evaluations. The woman described in those reports is not someone who would kill an innocent person." "Thank you, ma'am, but the evidence tells only part of the story, the part that certain people wanted to be told." Riley felt tears building in her eyes. "Ma'am, my own teammates testified against me. People I trusted with my life said I acted without authorization." Admiral Blackwood's expression hardened. "Your teammates were told things about that mission that weren't true. They were given false information to protect a larger operation. They genuinely believed what they testified because that's what they were told to believe. I don't understand. The man you shot wasn't an innocent civilian, Lieutenant. He was a foreign intelligence operative who had discovered the real nature of your mission. He was about to expose an American agent who had been working undercover for 3 years. Your shot didn't kill an innocent person. It saved the life of someone who had been risking everything to serve our country. Riley felt like the weight of the world was lifting from her shoulders. Then why didn't anyone tell me? Why did they let me think I had killed someone innocent? Because the operation was so sensitive that even you couldn't be told the complete truth. The agent you saved is still active, still gathering intelligence that protects American lives every day. If the real nature of the mission had been revealed, during your trial it would have exposed that agent and destroyed 3 years of work. Admiral Blackwood reached across the table and placed her hand over Riley's. But I couldn't let you be destroyed to protect an operation, no matter how important. Some things are more important than secrecy, and justice is one of them. What happens now? The 6th and final day began differently than any day Riley had experienced in months. Instead of being woken up in her cell at dawn, a guard came to her door at sunrise with news that changed everything. Lieutenant Chen, you're being released. Admiral Blackwood is here to escort you personally. Riley couldn't believe it. After weeks of handcuffs and orange jumpsuits, she was finally free. As she walked through the courthouse corridors one last time, she noticed that the building felt completely different. The oppressive atmosphere of judgment and suspicion had been replaced by something that felt almost celebratory. Admiral Blackwood waited for her in the main courtroom. But she wasn't alone. Captain Thompson was there, smiling broader than Riley had ever seen him. Commander Patricia Wells, who had testified against her, stood nearby with tears in her eyes. Most surprising of all, her entire team was present. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Corporal Amy Washington, Staff Sergeant Kevin Park, and the others who had been forced to testify against her. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Admiral Blackwood said formally. "Are you ready to get your life back?" Riley nodded, not trusting her voice to speak without breaking down completely. Admiral Blackwood approached her with something Riley hadn't seen in weeks, her military insignia, ribbons, and name tag. Each piece of her identity that had been stripped away was carefully returned to its proper place on her uniform. "By the authority of the Department of the Navy," Admiral Blackwood announced to everyone present, "all charges against Lieutenant Riley Chen are hereby dropped. Her record is restored to full standing, and she is reinstated to active duty with all privileges and honors." But the Admiral wasn't finished. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small box that Riley recognized immediately. It contained the Navy Cross, one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Blackwood continued, "for extraordinary heroism during a classified operation on March 15th, for making a split-second decision that saved the life of an American intelligence operative and prevented the compromise of a critical national security operation, you are hereby awarded the Navy Cross." Riley felt her legs go weak. The Navy Cross? She had gone from facing life in prison to receiving one of the military's highest honors. As Admiral Blackwood pinned the medal to Riley's uniform, she whispered quietly, "This should have happened months ago. I'm sorry it took so long to get here." The ceremony was interrupted by footsteps approaching from behind. Riley turned to see her father, Colonel David Chen, walking toward her in his dress uniform. His face was streaked with tears, and his expression showed a mix of pride, relief, and anger at what his daughter had been put through. "Dad," Riley said simply, and found herself wrapped in the strongest hug of her life. "I never doubted you," he whispered into her ear. "Not for 1 second." When they separated, Riley saw that her entire team was waiting to speak with her. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez stepped forward first, his face showing the weight of guilt and regret. "Riley," he began, then stopped and started again. "Lieutenant, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. We all do." Mike, Admiral Blackwood explained everything. You didn't know the real situation. That doesn't make it right. We should have trusted you instead of the briefing materials. We should have known that if you took a shot, you had a good reason. Corporal Amy Washington stepped forward next, her young face serious and determined. Lieutenant, I've learned more about leadership and integrity from watching you handle this situation than I learned in 2 years of training. I want you to know that if I'm ever in a situation like this, I hope I can show half the courage you've shown. Staff Sergeant Kevin Park, who had testified about Riley being impulsive, shook his head as he approached. I called you impulsive, on the witness stand. The truth is, you were the most thoughtful and careful leader I ever served under. Your quick thinking saved lives that night, and I'm ashamed that I didn't stand up for you when it mattered. Riley felt overwhelmed by the support, but also by the realization of how much damage had been done to trust and relationships within her team. We're going to have to rebuild, she told them honestly. All of us. What happened here hurt everyone, not just me. Admiral Blackwood interrupted the reunion with news about the investigation into how the cover-up had happened. Lieutenant, I wanted you to know that we've identified the people responsible for putting you in this situation. There was a faction within military intelligence that decided protecting the operation was more important than protecting you. They manipulated the evidence, pressured witnesses, and orchestrated the entire prosecution. What's going to happen? To them? They're facing court-martial for conspiracy, perjury, and abuse of authority. What they did to you was not just wrong, it was criminal. Riley thought about the prosecutor, the witnesses who had been pressured to lie, and the officials who had seemed so confident in their case. What about the people who were just following orders? The prosecutor seemed to genuinely believe I was guilty. The prosecutor has been briefed on the real situation. He's requested to personally apologize to you, and he's cooperating fully with the investigation. He was as much a victim of the false information as anyone else. Admiral Blackwood pulled Riley aside for a private conversation as the others talked among themselves. Lieutenant, I have an offer for you. After everything you've been through, you've more than earned the right to any assignment you want. Name it, and it's yours. Riley had been thinking about this possibility during the long nights in her cell. Admiral, I'd like to request assignment to the Naval Special Warfare Training Command. I want to train the next generation of SEAL operators. Teaching, after everything you've experienced in combat operations, especially because of everything I've experienced. These young officers need to understand that sometimes they're going to face situations that are more complex than any briefing can prepare them for. They need to know how to make moral decisions when the information they have is incomplete or wrong. Admiral Blackwood smiled approvingly. That's an excellent choice. We need instructors who understand the real challenges our people face in the field. There's something else, Admiral. I want to develop training programs about ethical decision-making in combat. Not just the legal rules of engagement, but how to maintain your integrity when you're caught between competing loyalties or incomplete information. Consider it done. You'll have full support to develop whatever programs you think are necessary. As the morning progressed, more people arrived to welcome Riley back to freedom. Mrs. Rodriguez, Sergeant Mike's mother, was there with homemade cookies and a smile that could have powered the entire building. Other families from her unit came to show their support, bringing flowers, cards, and expressions of faith that had never wavered. The media was also present, but the tone was completely different from the hostile coverage of the previous weeks. Now they wanted to tell the story of an officer who had been wrongly accused and finally vindicated. Riley agreed to give one brief statement. I want to thank Admiral Blackwood for her courage in coming forward with the truth, Riley said to the cameras. I also want people to understand that my teammates who testified against me were not at fault. They were given false information and asked to tell the truth as they understood it. The real blame lies with the people who created this situation in the first place. She paused, thinking carefully about her next words. I also want to say that what happened to me could happen to any service member who finds themselves caught between competing priorities and classified information. We need to do better at protecting our people, not just our operations. As the press conference ended, Riley found herself alone for a few minutes with Captain Thompson, the young lawyer who had fought so hard for her. "Captain, I owe you my life. If you hadn't started digging into those inconsistencies..." Thompson shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Lieutenant. I was just doing my job. Besides, you're the one who had the courage to maintain your innocence when everyone was telling you to give up. What's next for you?" "I'm being transferred to the Judge Advocate General's office in Washington. They want me to work on cases involving classified operations and national security. Apparently, this case taught me skills they think will be valuable. Now the truth comes out. At least, as much of it as we can safely reveal. The charges against you will be dropped, and the people who orchestrated this cover-up will face consequences." Riley thought about her teammates, about the testimony they had given. "What about my team? They lied under oath." "They didn't lie, Lieutenant. They told the truth as they understood it. They were given false briefing materials and incorrect information. They're as much victims of this situation as you are." Admiral Blackwood stood up, her formal bearing returning. "There will be a full investigation into how this happened. Someone decided that protecting an operation was more important than protecting you, and that someone made a serious error in judgment." As Admiral Blackwood prepared to leave, Riley called out to her, "Ma'am, why did you come forward? Why risk exposing the operation to save me?" The Admiral turned back with a slight smile. "Because 32 years ago, I was a young lieutenant who found herself in an impossible situation. Someone took a risk to help me then, and I swore that if I ever had the chance, I would do the same for someone else." She paused at the door. "Also, because the Navy doesn't abandon its people. Not on my watch." As Admiral Blackwood left the courtroom, Riley sat alone with Captain Thompson, trying to process everything that had just happened. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The trial part is over," Thompson replied. "Tomorrow, the charges will be formally dropped. But there's still going to be a lot of work to do to clear your name completely and make sure this never happens to anyone else." Riley nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I can't believe she risked her career to save mine." "That's what real leaders do," Thompson said. "They protect their people, even when it's difficult or dangerous." As Riley was escorted back to her cell for what she hoped would be the last time, she thought about Admiral Blackwood's words. The Navy doesn't abandon its people. After weeks of feeling completely alone, she finally understood that she had never been truly abandoned after all. Riley smiled. "Good. We need lawyers who understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought in courtrooms, not on foreign battlefields." As the afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, Riley took one last look around, the room where she had fought for her freedom and her reputation. The handcuffs were gone, the orange jumpsuit was replaced by her proper uniform, and the medals on her chest told the true story of her service. But more than that, she was surrounded by people who believed in her father, her teammates, her new mentor, Admiral Blackwood, and even the young lawyer who had refused to give up on her case. 6 months later, Riley stood in front of her first class of new SEAL candidates at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in San Diego. The students sat quietly as she began her lecture on ethical decision-making in combat operations. "Today I want to talk to you about a situation where a SEAL operator had to make a split-second decision with incomplete information," she began. "This operator was told the mission was a simple hostage rescue, but the reality was much more complex." She walked around the classroom, making eye contact with each of her students. The operator had to choose between following the rules as she understood them and taking action to protect an American life. She chose to act, and that choice saved a fellow service member. But because the full truth couldn't be revealed at the time, she was accused of murder and faced the possibility of life in prison. One of the students raised his hand. "What happened to the operator, ma'am?" Riley smiled, touching the Navy cross on her uniform. She learned that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone until the truth comes to light. She learned that real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when everyone seems to be against you. She paused, looking out the window at the Pacific Ocean where she had done some of her earliest training. She also learned that she was never really alone. There are always people willing to fight for the truth, even when it's dangerous or difficult. The key is never giving up hope that justice will eventually prevail. As the class ended and the students filed out, Riley reflected on the long journey from that courthouse to this classroom. The handcuffs were just a memory now, but the lessons learned during those dark months would guide her for the rest of her career. She had gone from being shackled as an accused criminal to wearing the Navy Cross as a decorated hero. But more importantly, she had discovered that her true mission wasn't just to serve her country in combat. It was to ensure that future generations of warriors would be better prepared for the moral complexities they would face. The trial was over, but her real work was just beginning.